There are stories people tell for entertainment, and then there are stories people tell quietly, almost reluctantly, the kind of stories that are not meant to entertain, but to warn. Across the deserts of the American Southwest, the land stretches for miles in every direction. Towering mesas rise from the earth, and the nights grow so dark that the stars seem almost close enough to touch. In places like this, the silence can feel almost alive. For centuries, people living in these regions passed down stories about things that move through the darkness. Not animals, not quite human either. Among the Navajo people, there is a legend that has been spoken about with caution for generations. Many who know the story prefer not to talk about it openly, because according to tradition, even speaking about it can bring unwanted attention. The legend describes something known as a skinwalker, but unlike the monsters of modern horror stories, the skinwalker was never meant to be entertainment. These stories were warnings, passed quietly from one generation to the next. According to traditional belief, a skinwalker begins as a human, someone who chooses to abandon the spiritual laws of their community, all for power, power that is believed to come from something dark and deeply unnatural. Those who walk this path are said to gain abilities that most people would consider impossible. The most widely known is the power to transform into animals: wolves, coyotes, owls, creatures that roam the desert after dark. But people who claim to have encountered these beings often describe something unsettling. The animals never behave quite the way normal animals should. There is always something about them that feels wrong. Sometimes they move with an intelligence that seems almost human. Sometimes their eyes reflect the light in strange ways. And sometimes they simply stand and watch. Some stories even claim these beings can mimic human voices, a familiar voice calling out from the darkness, even when the person that voice belongs to is nowhere nearby. For generations, stories like these remained part of local tradition. Most outsiders dismissed them as folklore, just another collection of legends born from fear of the unknown. In 1994, a family named the Shermans purchased a quiet cattle ranch in northeastern Utah. At first glance, the property looked like the perfect place to start a new life. The ranch stretched across hundreds of acres of open land, surrounded by wide valleys, distant mesas, and endless desert sky. To the Sherman family, it seemed peaceful, isolated, almost untouched by the outside world. But what they didn't realize at the time was that the land they had just bought carried a reputation that locals had whispered about for years. Almost immediately after moving in, the Shermans began to notice strange details around the property. Heavy bolts had been installed on both the inside and outside of several doors. Large metal chains were fixed to gates and fences. At first, the family assumed the previous owners had simply been cautious. But as they explored the property further, the odd precautions began to feel less like security and more like protection from something outside. Neighbors in the nearby area were friendly but cautious when the ranch was mentioned. Some warned the family that strange things had been reported in the region for years. Stories of unusual animals roaming the land at night, lights appearing silently in the sky, and unexplained sounds echoing across the desert. Most of these stories sounded like nothing more than rural folklore, at least at first. But only days after settling into their new home, the Shermans experienced something that would make them question everything they had heard. One evening, while working outside near the corrals, the family noticed something moving in the distance. At first, it looked like a large animal approaching the livestock, but as it came closer, it became clear that this creature was unlike anything they had ever seen before. The animal looked like an enormous wolf, far larger than any normal wolf should have been. It walked calmly towards the corral, showing no fear of the people standing nearby. Even as the family shouted and tried to scare it away, the creature simply continued forward, as if it didn't see them as a threat at all. And what happened next would become one of the most famous encounters ever associated with the ranch. The creature that stood in front of the Shermans did not behave like any animal they had ever seen before, even when the family shouted at it, even when they waved their arms and tried to scare it away. The massive wolf simply kept walking forward, calm, unbothered, almost curious. It approached the corral slowly, its glowing eyes fixed on the frightened cattle inside. And the closer it came, the more the Shermans realized something was terribly wrong. This was no ordinary predator. The creature continued walking towards the corral, slowly and almost casually, as if the shouting and movement around it meant nothing. Realizing the danger to their livestock, the father finally raised his rifle and aimed directly at the animal. The shot echoed across the quiet desert night. The bullet struck the creature at close range, but instead of collapsing, the enormous wolf barely reacted. It simply stood there, staring back at them, as if the gunshot had meant nothing at all. The family fired again, and then again. Several shots struck the massive animal. Each time the bullets hit, the creature flinched slightly, but it never collapsed. It never ran. Instead, the enormous wolf simply stood there in the darkness, staring back at them, its glowing eyes fixed on the family, calm, unmoving, as if it was studying them. And then slowly, the creature turned away and began walking back toward the darkness beyond the ranch. For a moment, no one moved. The family simply stood there in silence, staring at the massive animal in disbelief. Any normal predator would have fled after the first gunshot, but this creature had barely reacted at all. Then, slowly, the enormous wolf turned its head toward the darkness beyond the ranch. Without any sign of fear or injury, it began to walk away. Step by step, the creature moved toward the distant tree line, and within moments, it disappeared into the night, leaving the Sherman family standing in stunned silence. For several seconds, the family remained frozen in place, staring into the darkness where the creature had vanished. No one spoke. The cattle inside the corral slowly began to settle, their nervous movement fading as the night grew quiet again. But something about what had just happened didn't make sense. The animal had been shot multiple times at close range. Any normal predator would have collapsed, or at least fled. Yet this creature had simply turned and walked away, as if the bullets had meant nothing. And standing there in the cold, desert night, the Sherman family began to understand something deeply unsettling. Whatever had visited their ranch that evening was not a normal animal. The following morning, the Sherman family returned to the corral. The strange encounter from the night before was still fresh in their minds. None of them had slept well. What they had witnessed didn't make sense. The massive wolf had been shot multiple times at close range, yet it had simply walked away into the darkness. But in the cold light of day, they hoped to find some kind of explanation, something that would make the events of the previous night seem less impossible. So they began searching the ground around the ranch, looking for tracks. It didn't take long before they found them. Large paw prints pressed deep into the dirt near the corral. The tracks were enormous, far larger than any wolf track the family had ever seen before. Each print sank deep into the ground, as if whatever had made them carried tremendous weight. And the tracks continued away from the ranch, leading directly towards the tree line where the creature had disappeared. Curious, and more than a little uneasy, the family decided to follow them. The tracks were easy to see. They stretched across the open land behind the ranch, forming a clear trail through the dirt and grass. For several hundred yards, the prints continued exactly as expected, large, deep, and unmistakably real. But then something strange began to happen. Without warning, the tracks simply stopped. Not gradually, not fading into the ground. They ended abruptly, as if the creature had taken one final step and then vanished. The ground beyond the final print was completely untouched. No additional tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing. The Shermans stood in silence, staring at the empty ground. Predators don't simply disappear. Animals leave trails, they run, they hide, they circle back. But whatever had left these tracks had done none of those things. The prints simply ended. And once again, the family was forced to confront a disturbing possibility. Something unnatural was happening on their land. At first, the Sherman family tried to explain the strange events in ordinary ways. Perhaps the massive wolf had been some unknown predator. Perhaps the tracks had simply been distorted by the soft ground. People often look for simple explanations when something impossible happens. But as the days passed, it became clear that the encounter with the creature had not been an isolated incident, because the strange activity around the ranch did not stop. In fact, it seemed to be increasing. Late at night, the family began noticing strange animals appearing near the property. Large, dark shapes moving slowly along the tree line, creatures watching the ranch from the shadows. Sometimes they looked like wolves. Other times they appeared taller, almost human in the way they moved. And whenever someone tried to approach them, the figures would quietly disappear into the darkness. But the animals were not the only strange visitors. On several nights, the Shermans noticed unusual lights moving through the sky above the ranch. Small glowing objects drifting silently over the fields. Sometimes they hovered in place. Other times they moved quickly across the horizon before vanishing behind the distant mesas. The lights made no sound, and no aircraft the family knew of behaved that way. Even the livestock began behaving strangely. Cattle that had been calm for years suddenly became nervous and restless. Dogs refused to leave the house at night, and sometimes the animals would stare into the darkness beyond the fences, as if they sensed something that the humans could not see, something watching from the shadows. By the end of that first month, the Sherman family had begun to understand something unsettling. The ranch was not simply home to one mysterious creature. It seemed to attract strange phenomena of every kind. Animals that should not exist, lights in the sky that moved without sound, and a constant feeling that something unseen was observing the land. Whatever was happening on that ranch was far bigger than the encounter with the giant wolf. In the weeks that followed, the strange activity on the ranch began to take a darker turn. One morning, the Sherman family discovered something deeply disturbing in one of their cattle fields. A cow was lying motionless in the grass. At first glance, it appeared to have died during the night. But as they moved closer, they realized something was terribly wrong. The animal had been mutilated. Precise cuts had been made around parts of the body. The tissue looked almost surgical, clean, deliberate. There were no signs of a struggle, no scattered dirt, no torn grass, just the silent body of the animal lying in the field. Even stranger, there was almost no blood. Despite the severe wounds, the ground around the cow remained mostly untouched. No drag marks, no predator tracks, nothing that would normally explain what had happened. It was as if the animal had simply been placed there. As the family examined the scene more closely, they noticed something else that made the situation even more unsettling. The strange paw prints they had discovered days earlier were nowhere to be found. There were no tracks around the body at all. No footprints, no signs that anything had approached the animal during the night. For ranchers, losing cattle is not unusual. Predators exist, accidents happen. But what the Shermans were seeing did not resemble anything natural. The wounds were too clean, too precise, and the silence surrounding the scene felt wrong. As the days passed, more animals were found in similar conditions. Each discovery raised more questions than answers, and slowly, the family began to realize that the strange creatures they had seen near the ranch might not be the only mystery hiding in the darkness of that land.